We've got Steve Helwick on the line from SB Nation's Underdog Dynasty and also Hustle Belt. He breaks down the group of five for us here. So, Steve, we're in an interesting situation with just a couple weeks left in the season. The college football playoff is also always controversial, but this particular season, it's wide open to a number of controversies because of the discrepancy in games played. Conferences aren't playing each other, all of that. So would like to throw out the candidates for the playoff and to a certain extent, just the New Year's Six bowl games that come from the group of five and get your thoughts about, their season, what they've got left and what they need to do. And I think it starts with Cincinnati. I just think they're an extremely quality football team that plays in a tough American conference. They have not only won the games, but outside of UCF, they've dominated the games. So they sit at 8-0. They've missed the Temple game. They have to reschedule Tulsa. That game's coming up December 12th.
They weren't really going to get too much out of the Temple game in terms of surprising result. It was just going to be another beatdown. Temple has really taken a step back this season. But I think playing just helps to keep yourself fresh in the minds of the committee, see what Cincinnati did this weekend, and you never want to have an off game, and that's what they did. I think Ohio State as another team that might be a result of maybe some slippage in the polls just because of the inability to take the field. So I think that was disappointing for Cincinnati to have a very winnable game just to another domination canceled. But Cincinnati is such a complete team. The beginning of the year, we knew that this was going to be a very good defensive team. I mean, Jarrell White from the outside linebacker position is a really special talent, one of the best backfield tacklers in college football this year. Then you have, I'd put Cincinnati's top three cornerbacks against any other cornerbacks in the country. Then you have Ahmad Garner, who was the most talented freshman in the AAC last year, Kobe Bryant, and Arquan Bush. And I thought we had a really good matchup to see how good they really were against UCF, who has one of the best receiving corps in the nation when those two teams met. And I thought that was the biggest win Cincinnati's had this year. Was I know they beat down SMU, they beat down Memphis, but I wanted to see how Cincinnati would do against an offense that was putting up historic numbers and averaging about 600 yards per game in UCF. And they held them only to 33 points, and they came back from down double digits and won. And earlier in the year, I didn't think Cincinnati had the offense to maybe match what UCF has, but Desmond Ridder is getting better week by week. At the beginning of the year, it was kind of a disaster from the pocket for him. He had that 3-interception game against South Florida, but he really changed the tone around his game. And that when he played SMU, he ran for about 180 yards that game, didn't throw a pick. And then he's continued that rampage ever since. He had a really good game against Memphis in the pocket, just slinging that ball deep to his wideouts like Alec Pierce, and it was working well. And he did that again against UCF and had 338 passing yards, which I believe is his highest mark since 2018. So Desmond Ridder's improvement is really how Cincinnati is now one of those top-tier teams. Defense has always been there, but now they have a semblance of an offense. And I believe if Cincinnati runs a table, they should absolutely compete in the college football playoff, especially with how they've dominated opponents on a week-to-week basis.
So you're going to move Cincinnati in if Ohio State goes undefeated, Alabama, let's say, wins the SEC, but Clemson comes back and beats Notre Dame, and we've got a split between those two in the ACC.
Especially in a year like this, when we're not seeing non-conference play, I think that ACC title game should absolutely be an elimination game for the playoff. I mean, it's a postseason game already. I don't think people really want to see Clemson versus Notre Dame round 3 in a single season if those two teams make the playoffs. It feels like Notre Dame's a lock right now because they play Syracuse this week, and then they'll have Clemson in the ACC title game. And even if they lose that game, they'll have that win over Clemson. But I think that ACC title game needs to be an elimination game, especially when we're not seeing non-conference play this year. I hate when people call Cincinnati like a group of 5 program because Cincinnati's been here before. 2-9, Cincinnati finished the season number 3 in the BCS rankings. And it's the same program. The only thing that's changed is a Big East patch on their jersey to an American Conference patch. I know Brian Kelly was a coach back then, Luke Fickell, but this is the same program and nobody discredited Cincy off their brand name in 2009. So why are you going to do it in 2020? Also, the American Conferences, there's a lot of good teams in there. SMU, I know they had a bad loss to ECU this weekend, Memphis is pretty good for the most part. They've taken a bit of a step back this year, but they still have a good offense behind Ryan Silverfield. And UCF, top offense in the country, and UCF really could be that team that Cincinnati is right now. They lost 3 games where they held double-digit leads and squandered fourth-quarter leads in all of them. So that's another very talented team, and they were there just a couple years ago with that national championship season in 2017. So I don't ever discredit the American Conference because I think they're right up there with the ACC and the Pac-12. They don't have that Clemson team really that just dominates every single year. But if you look at the rest of the talent in the conference, the Americans are just right up there. So Cincinnati's had a good enough schedule to do this, and they'll have Tulsa probably twice on the final week of the season and in the American Conference Championship game. If you remember, Tulsa went wire to wire with a potential Big 12 champion in Oklahoma State. And if Oklahoma State didn't prevent a touchdown with a face mask penalty, maybe we're talking about Tulsa winning that game on the road.
I can certainly support and I can certainly refute your claim about Cincinnati in the group of 5. On one hand, I don't think there's any question that the American Conference has acquitted itself extremely well for the past 5 or 6 years against the major conferences, especially in postseason play. They have routinely played well and won those games. You can go team by team by team by team, year by year by year, especially in that one group of 5 matchup in the New Year's Six, like we saw last year, Memphis taking on Penn State. It was a game down to the last 5 minutes of the game. And certainly, if you look at the performance of the ACC and the Pac-12 in particular, aside from Clemson, and matched it up with the American Conference over the past couple of years, it would be a fascinating matchup to look at those teams and have them actually meet on the field consistently, because I think the American Conference could match up pretty well. On the other side, if we go back to 2009 and that Brian Kelly Cincinnati team, they, of course, came out of a weak Big East. I never thought that the Big East should have been included in the Bowl Championship Series because it was just not a strong enough conference. And once they emerged as an undefeated team, they then went to the Sugar Bowl, and the game was 37-3 at halftime against Florida. So they were not ready for that. And
Brian Kelly wasn't there.
Pardon me?
Brian Kelly did not coach that game.
Yeah, he didn't coach that game, and he was happy he was not coaching that game because they were not prepared to play a top 5 team in Florida. So I can look at that both sides. Again, a Memphis team last year that was the best in the American Conference played a really good game in the Cotton Bowl against Penn State, but they were playing about the 10th best team in the country, and they lost by a couple scores in a competitive game. Cincinnati was the most likely the second best team in the group of 5 last year. They went to Columbus and lost by 6 touchdowns. So there's evidence on both sides of that argument. All right, Steve, let's look at BYU. They're the oddest example here just because of the schedule that they've mostly dominated, although they had a bit of an unimpressive showing against Texas State, winning by a touchdown. Houston and Boise State are probably the best wins on the schedule. At 9-0, they've got San Diego State coming up on the 12th.
I think BYU was severely underranked by the College Football Playoff Committee at 14, especially when you consider the dominant fashion in most of their wins, especially when they played a Boise State team that's gone unscathed in the Mountain West. They had that tough game against Houston where they were down toward the end of the third quarter, but really turned on the burners at the end and beat the Cougars. And I think the Cougars are a very solid team who's just been victims of a tough schedule. They played Cincinnati, BYU, and UCF are their 3 losses, but they look pretty good in each of their 3 wins. So I think those are 2 solid wins for BYU. And here's one problem I have putting BYU at 14 is we have Miami right now at number 10. And I like to point, so what wins does Miami have that are that better than BYU when Miami also has a 42-17 loss to Clemson? BYU could probably lose 42-17 to Clemson. I think a lot of people think that. But Miami has a victory over 7-3 NC State, which I would say is its best win. And I'd say its second best win is a 31-19 win over 5-5 Pitt. So are those wins that much better than beating Boise State and Houston is the debate that I kind of would like to get started with how underranked BYU might be this season. Because the Cougars, they're not just, I know it's a soft schedule, but they're dominating a soft schedule. It's not that they're barely winning. I know the UTSA game was more of a defensive matchup, and that was one game where they kind of let it slip. But every team has those games. Clemson had that same one against Boston College this year. Every team has those games where they barely win, and it's a lot closer than it should be. So BYU had that game. But when you look at the numbers Zach Wilson's putting up on offense, and you look at what Gunnar Romney and Dax Milne have done at the receiver positions this year, Tyler Algier as a running back, BYU is absolutely loaded on offense, and I would put them toe-to-toe with a lot of teams. Now, I'm not saying that they should be in the college football playoff or that they're better than Cincinnati, because right now I don't have them in those points. But right now I think they should at least be top 8. I don't know, below Florida, Texas A&M maybe is top 8, because BYU has an absolutely stellar resume. And it really started on Labor Day weekend when they beat Navy 55-3, and they've kept it up since then. So I think BYU's really getting slept on. And the one thing the Cougars can do to change it is they have an open date on December 19th, and that's a conference championship week for a lot of people. And they could probably try to schedule a team. I know they had that scheduling talk with Washington already. Washington's probably the best team in the Pac-12. You could argue Colorado or USC are also undefeated. But you need a team of maybe that caliber, and you need to beat the brakes off that team. Maybe if the Washington-Oregon loser won't be in the Pac-12 championship game and they'll be available that weekend, that's a game I would absolutely focus on scheduling if you're BYU. And that's a game where both teams would benefit from a victory, especially in the rankings.
No, it's a fascinating comparison between BYU and Miami, because to your side of the argument, BYU's dominating its schedule. Miami's winning those games by 1 score. They've beaten almost all the teams that we've talked about, which are pretty much in the same bucket. NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech. You could throw them all in the 45 to 60 range in the country, something in that range. And they're beating most of those teams by 1 score. They've been close games. BYU, again, dominating, crushing teams that are more in that 75 to 100 range, though. So it's an interesting conversation between BYU and Miami. I've got the Cougars at 10 and Miami at 11. All right, Coastal Carolina's at 9-0. Of course, they've got Liberty coming up and Troy as well. They've got the nice wins against Louisiana and App State.
I don't think Coastal Carolina will have too much struggle with Liberty this weekend. I know I've been talking about a lot of teams from how they're underrated, but I think Liberty's one of the ones that's overrated, actually. You look at Liberty's schedule, I'm pulling it up right now.
It's awful.
It's really bad. I know they got that win over a 4-5 Virginia Tech team. Very bizarre win where Virginia Tech pretty much won it, and then they found out that timeout was called before that field goal attempt that they blocked in return for a touchdown. But Liberty's wins this year are winless UMass. You have 2-7 Southern Miss, which fired its coach and is on its 3rd coach of the season because the interim left to take an FCS job. You have 1-9 Syracuse. You have winless ULM. You have winless FIU, and you have a WKU team that's 4-6 and really has not beaten anyone of substance. And they barely skated by WKU and a winless FIU team. I don't think Liberty is that talented, but still, they're ranked right now, and I guess that'll help Coastal Carolina schedule-wise. So that's where College Game Day is going this weekend. But here's why I like Coastal Carolina, is because they beat Louisiana, and Louisiana beat Iowa State. And that Louisiana's only loss is to Coastal Carolina. So right now, when I'm ranking teams and I see an undefeated team that's beat a 1-loss team and a 1-loss team that absolutely destroyed Iowa State on the road, then I'm putting it in that order. And I think Coastal Carolina's biggest advantage right now is the fact that they beat a Louisiana team that beat Iowa State. But the Chanticleers have looked really good. I mean, they were really challenged against an App State team that has controlled the Sun Belt the last 4 seasons. And Grayson McCall and the Chanticleers really took that challenge on. They won. I'm huge McCall because he's thrown, I think, 20 touchdowns this year with just 1 interception. He's been the absolute model of efficiency from the quarterback position. And also, I think he times his options better than any other quarterback in the country. If you watch him run a speed option, he runs that to perfection with CJ Maribel. So I think watching Coastal's offense is really fun, and they can give teams problems. So I really am looking forward to seeing how they handle Liberty this weekend, and I think they will be able to. And there's also Louisiana App State game this weekend, which I know Coastal's beaten both, but I think Coastal wants Louisiana to win that game. So they still have a Louisiana team with one loss that beat an Iowa State team, and that will be their biggest strength on the schedule.
Then we've got Marshall at 7-0. They've got Rice and FIU coming up. And, of course, their most notable win was over App State, 17-7.
Yes, Coastal Carolina also got that App State win that Marshall had. Marshall probably has the weakest schedule out of all the teams we've mentioned so far. And Marshall, the CUSA, is just struggling to get on the field. They only had one game last week, UTSA North Texas, and everything else was just canceled or postponed. So the CUSA is really struggling to take the field right now, and Marshall hasn't played since November 14th against Middle Tennessee. They've really played sporadically on the schedule this year, so availability is going to be a very tough thing to help Marshall in the conversation. When Marshall's on the field, they have the top defense in the country. They're only allowing 10 points per game. I said they have not played too many teams that are great, but they did that to App State. They held App State to 7 and won that game 17-7 at Jones C. Edwards Stadium earlier this year. And I do like a lot of the weapons they have on offense. Their freshman quarterback, Grant Wells, he has a beautiful deep ball. They have the best running back in the CUSA, Brendan Knox, and then their tight end, Xavier Gaines. You can line them up anywhere on the field. He can play wildcat quarterback for you, or he can just be the best pass catcher on the team and really strong tight end that and a good route runner that can burn opposing defenses. But Marshall's not really going to gain much from its games against Rice and FIU or its CUSA title game, because I don't think that they'll play either UAB or UTSA probably, and I don't think that win's going to push them over the edge. So Marshall is in a similar situation to where they were in 2014, if you remember them with Rakeem Cato, where they're dominating their schedule, but they didn't really have a convincing win over a team that people were convinced was a good team. They have App State this year, but that's about it, and that was very long ago in the season. I don't know if the CFP is really taking that too much into factor when they're ranking teams week by week.
Then we've got a team who's not necessarily in the mix, but an intriguing example out of the MAC in 4-0 Buffalo with the explosive Jared Patterson coming off a 70-point effort against Kent.
Mm-hmm. I think if Buffalo started their season at the same time Marshall did, Buffalo would be ranked in a similar position right now in the CFP rankings. Right now, the Bulls have played 4 games. They have annihilated their opponent in all of them. They have one of the top offenses in the nation, and it's controlled by the offensive line and Jarrett Patterson especially. And I don't think Buffalo's in really any CFP conversations. I think they're just trying to get ranked right now. But a conversation I would like to throw Buffalo in is the Heisman conversation. Jarrett Patterson, okay, we have the Heisman race this year as mainly quarterbacks. Mac Jones, Zach Wilson. You could throw Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, Ian Book. Just throw all the top quarterbacks in there. But are any of those quarterbacks doing something historic on a week-to-week basis? Because Jarrett Patterson, 2 weeks in a row, has just shattered record books. 1 week ago against Bowling Green, he goes for 301 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns, breaks the single-game MAC rushing record, breaks Buffalo's rushing record, and then he becomes the second running back ever behind Ricky Williams to do 2 straight 300-yard games when he goes for 409 rushing yards and an FBS record 8 touchdowns against an undefeated Kent State team. He's breaking records, and he's just going into the record book week by week. Right now, he's played 4 games. He's 5th in the country in rushing yards and 1 touchdown away from Najee Harris's lead. So I'm saying Jarrett Patterson's putting historic numbers up on a week-by-week basis. Playing Akron and Ohio next, he will probably get to the top of both of those categories. I really think it's time to start talking about him as the Heisman finalist, because he is far and away the best running back in college football this year. And the best running back can usually get a finalist spot. So I think the most intriguing conversation around Buffalo right now, I think they'll go undefeated. They've been absolutely dominant on offense, and their defense is solid enough too. But I'd really like to see Jarrett Patterson in New York on a Zoom call, however they're doing the Heisman ceremony this year. I'd love to see him there because he absolutely deserves it with the astronomical numbers he has put up this year.
Steve Helwick, Hustle Belt, and also Underdog Dynasty there on SB Nation. Steve, appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you. Appreciate it.